Welcome everyone. Today is our second webinar in a series of 3 from GSEO on business continuity during the coronavirus pandemic. We've got everyone on mute, so you don't have to worry if you've got kids or dogs asking for snacks or play with you in the background, so you don't have to worry about that. My name is Dan Murphy. I'm the program manager for Georgia Commute Options, and I'll be administering today's webinar session. Georgia Commute Options offers a suite of services that are available at no cost to help commuters and employers make the switch from driving alone as part of a regional strategy to reduce traffic and improve air quality. Today's webinar on creating a safe business environment for teleworkers was put together with the support of the transportation management associations in the region, one of which is Livable Buckhead. So we wanted to have Katie Gable, the program manager for mobility services, on today's webinar to have her say a few words about LBI. But before I do that, I have a few housekeeping notes. For the sake of the presenters, we have muted all participants for the duration of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a follow-up email with the recording. It will also be made available on the GSEO website. Next, I'd like to call out the Q&A feature here on Zoom. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, please just drop them in there. There's also a chat feature that we'll be moderating as well. That takes care of some of the major housekeeping items. And with that, I'll hand it over to Katie.
Hello, can you all hear me now? Yes. Hi, thanks so much, Dan, and for GSEO and the whole team for co-hosting us today on this webinar. So I just wanted to give a little background on Livable Buckhead before we jump into the presentation. So Livable Buckhead is a sustainability nonprofit helping to improve the quality of life and environment, specifically in Buckhead. We were founded in 1999 and originally known as the Buckhead Area Transportation Management Association, really solely focused on alternative transportation. And then in 2011, we expanded our programming and now encompass 8 different areas of sustainability, as you can see here. These program areas range from green space development to recycling programs, and of course, commute options. So, along with the telework resources that we're going to be speaking about today, by becoming a member of Livable Buckhead, you can receive several other services that I just wanted to highlight today that could be really beneficial to your business and company. These services include company consultations, GIS mapping, commute analysis, discounted transit passes, and many more. You can scan the QR code here today if you'd like to be more involved and become a member of Livable Buckhead. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Elham Shirazi. Elham is our consultant for implementing and expanding telework programs and has been a wonderful resource for Buckhead employers as well as the entire region for many, many years. She has over 30 years of experience developing policies and guidelines, conducting trainings, and evaluating programs. Recently, partner companies in Buckhead, such as Cumulus Media, Vacation Express, Hammockberg, and more, have had the opportunity to work with her. And in 2019, we were able to co-host GSEO's Telework Summit, where Elham and many regional organizations held peer-to-peer discussion about the work they've done with telework. Thank you, Elham, for joining us.
Thank you, Katie, for that warm introduction. And hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I hope some of you were able to join us last week when we talked about remote management in this environment of the pandemic. And today's session is going to be a little bit different in that we are going to talk a little bit more about the technicalities that are required when employees are going to be teleworking. And I do highly recommend that if you haven't, please do go and listen to the recording. As Dan mentioned, it is on the GSEO website. Because I think some of the questions you may have today might have been answered by that particular webinar. So I guess, you know, we're going from 0 to 100 on teleworking. There are so many organizations that were not willing to entertain teleworking that right now are in a position where they've had to make some decisions and tell their staff to go home and work for at least whatever the period of the pandemic is. And obviously that has yet to be determined. I do understand that in the city of Atlanta, now there is a shelter in place, as was initiated by the mayor. And, you know, different jurisdictions are at different points in how they are adapting to the current emergency. I was looking at a survey that was just recently on SHRM, and this was a survey conducted by a law firm of 500 of their members. So it's in no ways representative, but you know, data is really useful today. So whatever, you know, pieces of data we can find, I think might give us a good perspective of what's going on in the marketplace. According to this survey of the 500 employers, 62% of the employers are now considering teleworking when they didn't before. So if you fall into that realm, do not, you know, don't be scared. A lot of people are in the same position. And the purpose of today's webinar is to help you know what are some of the, you know, legal implications and how you can formalize your program a little bit more so that everybody is on the same page. Now, there are a lot of organizations that have teleworking in place, but have never had any guidelines. And there are some that only have been allowing it on an ad hoc basis. So you may, a lot of you may be, you know, in this category where you do not know the legal implications. And what we want to do today is impart that knowledge so that you can be cautious in how you are approaching teleworking so that you comply with all the legalities that are out there. So having said that, so the right direction to be looking into right now is to have a program that allows for business continuity during this crisis and make sure that teleworking is implemented in a well-planned and thoughtful process. The reason being is that hopefully at some point we will, of course, go back to a normal setting. And, you know, the more work that we do in this phase, the easier it will be to transition into, you know, a norm where maybe teleworking can be part and parcel of, you know, the alternatives that you are making available. And it may not be in a full-time capacity. It may be just a day a week or 2 days a week. So what are some of the laws that need to be reviewed in order to, you know, to have a good understanding of the legalese? I'm just gonna, you know, tell you there are a few categories. Obviously, there's the wage and hour laws, the FLSA, the workers' comp, the OSHA, you know, regulations, ADA or American Disabilities Act, the FMLA or the Family and Medical Leave Act, and then also the discrimination retaliation issues. I'm going to go through each of these one by one so you have a clear understanding of what they entail. However, what I do want to share with you is that we have been implementing teleworking since, you know, the 80s, and none of these issues have been a showstopper. And they can very easily be addressed in developing a policy or guidelines for your programs. So don't be alarmed, just know that there are solutions. Also wanted to point out, this is data from SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. And just to show you that, you know, telecommuting, teleworking has been steadily growing. Even since 2018, we're seeing more growth. And in fact, you know, as you can see, there's growth in full-time, part-time, ad hoc, and any type of teleworking. So once again, this is something that's happening in the workplace and is going on. Recently, the Atlanta Regional Commission in 2019 conducted a survey of about 5,000, of about 5,000 residents of the Metro Atlanta region. And what we found out from that survey is that in 2019, about 40% of employees did say that they had the opportunity to telework because their employer had said so. And again, that shows growth from 2014. So obviously, this is a very popular type of an arrangement and is probably growing faster than a lot of other commute options. So let's talk a little bit about the wage and labor laws. So basically, Federal Labor Standards Act establishes rules around the number of hours worked and obviously how those hours are being documented. We have two distinct categories. Generally, it's the exempt and the non-exempt. And obviously, salaried employees or the exempt, are the ones who can work longer hours and they can go above 40 hours. And, there is no record keeping required of that. However, if you have non-exempt employees who are going to be teleworking, you want to make sure that there is a way to document how many hours were worked in a 1 week period. If the amount goes above 40 hours, then overtime can kick in. So what organizations do is that they always instruct their employees to observe the existing rules regarding overtime, meaning that you don't go into overtime without your supervisor or manager approving it. However, I hope that this is raising some thoughts on how will you be able to document those hours, whether there's an electronic timekeeping mechanism or timesheet that can help you in this process. So that's it for the labor laws and FLSA. Let's talk about workers' comp and switch gears a little bit. Workers' comp obviously applies to the injuries in the workplace. And when employees work at home, home becomes an extension of work. So one of the things which is really important is to make sure that employees do have a dedicated workspace. I did go over some of this last time, but it doesn't help to repeat it. So that not the entire house or home is, part of where the work is being done. So you want your employees to pick a dedicated workspace at home. And, these pictures of people working all over the house, they probably are not good practices because we want employees to be safe. We want them to work in an ergonomic, kind of a setting where they have a desk, they have a chair. And it's important also to identify what are the core hours and, what are the working hours. So that if something happens outside of those hours, it's very clear, that if somebody wakes up at 3 a.m. and is going, down the stairs to get to their home office and they fall, 3 a.m. is not part of what is an acceptable work hour. So you want to make sure, again, the hours and the location, and obviously the injury should be, work related or happen while the employee is working at home. The challenge, I think, with today's environment is going to be a little bit, I would say, larger in that, we're throwing a lot of environments together at one time. I mean, the children are home, if you have elder parents living with you, they may be home. So there are a lot of externalities that we may not at first be able to control. I would recommend that, in these weeks, that organizations try to establish some criteria, parameters around what those work hours are, and hopefully how we can keep those distractions to a minimum. Has this been a showstopper? And I think this is a question that has come up many, many times. The good news is this has not been a litigious issue, before the courts. I think there are a number of factors that do help safeguard the process. And, obviously one of them is that, employees want to safeguard this opportunity. And also it's very difficult to hurt yourself, hopefully in your home environment while you're working. In the case that there is an injury, it should be reported. And that will be, that is also during this period of the, while we're trying to flatten the curve and staying at home. And I always recommend to our clients to please call your workers' comp carrier, tell them you're going to be having people teleworking. Typically, the answer is if you don't, that your rates stay the same unless you start getting a lot of cases. However, a conversation with your provider is highly recommended as a safety guard. In terms of OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Act, I can tell you that I was witness to this whole process, whereby in November 1999, somebody sent a question to OSHA and about whether or not employers should be inspecting home offices. And at first, the director of compliance responded yes. And I will tell you that there was hell broke loose on Capitol Hill because people really did not want to inspect employees' workplaces, nor bring about this concept of Big Brother is watching. Within a day, that opinion was removed, and OSHA very quickly did send out a memorandum which says employers do not need to inspect home offices, and OSHA will also not be conducting inspections of home offices for safety. If there's a complaint, the complaint, about a home office, the complainant will be informed of what OSHA's policy is. However, keep in mind that we are, this is a double-edged sword, because workers' comp can apply if someone's injured. And what we do as a practice with the employers that we worked with is give them safety checklists to distribute to their employees. And those are guidelines. I've been told by attorneys not to ask for those back, because if you take them back and an employee signed off on it, it may actually imply that you've said you've done an inspection. So provide the guidelines up front. We can help you with that, so that employees work in a safe area. And many employers also, in their policy or in their guidelines, do put in a clause that says that they reserve the right to inspect the workplace with, 48 hours of notice, or, with advance notice if needed. And that's usually if there is an injury. And typically, it won't be one person who will be going out. It definitely has to be two. It may be the supervisor and someone who is from risk management. We do not want to have supervisors going to employees' homes in this environment, and I'm sure supervisors don't want to do it either. Of course, it violates everything about social distancing, but that is not the intent of this particular aspect. I want to share with you that the federal government has one of the biggest teleworking programs in the country. And up to recently, some of the federal departments were actually telling the employees to lessen the amount that they were teleworking. And, but all of a sudden, because of what has happened, federal government has a huge mandate to actually allow, staff that are, in the category that lends itself to teleworking to be teleworking pretty much full time at this point. So if the federal government can do it, we can all do it. Another consideration is ADA, or the American Disabilities Act. And, ADA basically requires employers with more than 15 employees to provide reasonable accommodations, for employees with disabilities. Although telework can be considered a reasonable accommodation, employers are not required to actually provide telework in an accommodation. So the employer may consider, what are the job, duties and, the employee eligibility and technology to determine whether or not teleworking could be suitable. So there's nothing that says that it has to be an accommodation. In fact, there's never language in telework policies regarding ADA or FMLA, which I'm going to talk about next, because typically employees are supposed to just refer to existing policies impacting, those kinds of arrangements. So moving on with the Family and Medical Leave Act, and this is that, FMLA does require, it does provide job protected leave to eligible employees who are absent due to some form of, injury or health condition, or if they have to take care of a family member. However, again, under FMLA, telework is not an option when an employee has a serious condition or is, on approved FMLA. So your existing Family and Medical Leave Act, conditions remain in place. Let's talk a little bit about discrimination and retaliation. I really want us to, as employers, to be cognizant of the fact that as we're talking about teleworking in this context of the pandemic, to also be sensitive to the fact that not every employee, may have a job that lends itself to teleworking. In fact, based on data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2017, they're estimating that only 30% of the workforce can work remotely. So, we want to make sure that we're not creating haves and have-nots. And, if there are people whose functions are essential, we want to be cognizant of that. So, this is where having a policy, having some guidelines becomes really important so that the conditions under which teleworking is a possibility are outlined. And specifically, what I want to refer to is making sure that we are not creating a privileged group versus a non-privileged, or the haves and have-nots. And within the policy, and I'm going to talk with you about that in a slide or two, we can have language that very specifically states that teleworking is simply a workplace alternative or a solution. And we should really stay away from using the terms benefit or privilege in our descriptions of what teleworking is about. We also should be very clear about what the selection criteria are, so that it does go back to the jobs being appropriate, the employees being right for teleworking, the technology working, and the manager being on board. Typically, teleworking is a management prerogative, and we want to make sure that all these rules are going to be in place once we go back to a normal situation. So be careful, because again, these are not areas that have been litigious, but if we do communicate with the wrong messaging, we may be setting up, the organization, for some anti-discrimination types of issues. On all of these laws that I've been speaking about, please make sure that you are talking to your attorneys. I have been implementing teleworking since 1984, but I am not a lawyer. I know enough to tell you that you should pay attention to these laws, and again, make sure that that you have some level of legal assistance. Through the Georgia Commute Options, we have a lot of templates for developing policies and guidelines. Not all organizations are alike. Some organizations prefer having, a longer document. Some, have an employee handbook, which is a lot shorter, and they prefer guidelines. And again, we can definitely help you with those. Now, why do we think contracts, policies, or guidelines are necessary? I definitely think that it should be a starting point. First of all, it allows you as an organization to manage teleworking, in a safe environment. Because if the rules are written, or if the guidelines are clear, then managers, employees, everybody is on the same page. The problem is really in organizations which continue to do this informally and have nothing to guide them. So a lot of the decision making becomes subjective, and it actually causes probably a lot of misinformation and misinterpretation of what teleworking is about. The other aspect of having some policies or a guideline, and a guideline can be 2 pages, or page, is that if you're going to allow more than the 1s or 2s that are teleworking, on an ad hoc basis or right now, you really do want to have some rules of engagement so that you can accommodate more people. So if you've sent your employees home, you haven't started crafting anything, please start thinking about it. We want to make sure you don't fall into the legal pitfalls that I have gone over, and again, have constructive language, and we can help you with that. We want to make sure that this arrangement is really transparent to everybody, and it's, I think, our job as managers, as HR directors, also as the Georgia Commute Options, to make sure that employers have solutions that can stay in place after COVID-19. It may mean that we're not teleworking full time, but if it works, and if we've resolved a lot of the technology issues and the teamwork issues, why not allow it a day or 2 a week so we have a lot less congestion? Okay. Based on the survey that the ARC, or Atlanta Regional Commission, conducted in 2019, what we found out was that basically of the employees that were teleworking, 41% of them said that they had a formal program in place. I think what's the not so good news part of it is that 55%, or actually even close to 60%, had informal arrangements and or didn't know what the rules were. And when we're looking at the non-teleworkers, as you can see, a really large proportion, or about over 60%, did not have a program in place. So this issue of having formal guidelines, I think, is important as we're expanding teleworking to more employees, and especially for the period of this emergency that we don't know how long it's going to last. And I thought it would be also interesting for you, because you may be, an employer of is larger or medium size, and as you can see, overall, based on this data that was collected by Zenefits, and there's a description of what Zenefits is, from their clientele, basically 42% across the board of the employers had a formal policy. However, again, I think the glaring numbers are that over 50% didn't, close to 55%. Were really fall into the category if they were unsure, they didn't, or it's an unofficial policy. The difference between an official policy and a non-official policy, or formal and non-formal, is that with a formal program, you've got some guidelines, and those are shared with everybody. Everybody's on the same page. Sometimes training is a component of that. Sometimes there's an agreement that an employee signs which says, I will abide by these rules, and something that a manager signs which says, I will allow that employee to telework. And again, we can get into levels of complexity as we work with you one-on-one. So that's the difference. Now, as you can see on this chart, the propensity of offering a formal program increases as we're looking at employers of a larger size. So with smaller employers, the likelihood is less, but as we're looking at mid-size and even larger size employers, obviously it's greater. Okay. So what would typically be involved in a program's guidelines? Usually they're goals. Again, we have templates for all of these, and Dan will refer you to a very short guideline that we've developed for the purposes of this emergency at the end of this webinar. But the goals have to be clear. In fact, if the goal is for now to mitigate the impacts of the coronavirus, that should clearly be in the goals, because that may not be a goal after the period of the emergency. But other typical goals are, to improve recruitment, retention, improve productivity, provide balance in work life, improve flexibility, improve sustainability. So I would say, draw on keywords, but if the main driver is COVID-19, be clear about that right now, because we don't want to raise expectations that this is a program that may be in place in this form after the emergency goes away. It's all about managing expectations. So we want to also make sure that the selection criteria are clear, and typically, this is available to jobs that can be done, remotely. They're non-essential functions, because some of the essential functions may have to even be, handled on site, even during the emergency. And we want to be clear that it isn't based on an assessment of the employee, the job, the technology. A lot of times employers don't even consider an employee unless they're hitting or exceeding productivity requirements. So it's for the employees that we know are doing a good job. A lot of times there's also something in the eligibility which says you must have been with the organization for a certain amount of time to be even considered, or you have to be past, the first month or so. Obviously, some of this has gone out the door at the moment, but these are all considerations for the future of the program. I think, the program guidelines should be clear about how frequently this is allowed. It may be full-time now, and it may go back to, part-time, meaning a day or two a week later. And obviously, coverage is important when we go back to a normal, hopefully, phase, so that, there are enough people in the office who may need to be there for specific functions. The communication needs should be very clear about employee availability, employee accessibility, that they are available, accessible by email, by phone call. And obviously, some of that right now may be hampered a little bit because, you know, we're employees are sent home, the kids are home, there are other distractions, but the more clarity we can get around what are some core hours and what are some flex hours will really help minimize the amount of confusion around, you know, when it's okay to communicate. Obviously, there's language on this workers' comp issue that the employees are responsible for the safety of their workplace. And, you know, if there is an accident, they have to report it, as well as the employer reserves the right to inspect the workplace if needed. And believe me, I would say in the universe of teleworking, probably a good 90% of teleworkers have never had an inspection. Some employers, when they're implementing full-time programs, because they're setting it up for employees, do conduct an inspection. But it's not something that most employers are engaged in. We also want to be very clear about technology, you know, what is available, what is safe, what is secure, how employees should be logging in. Our Thursday webinar will talk a lot about technology and what's safe and secure and what collaborative tools should be available in this environment. We also want to talk about insurance of the equipment if the employees are providing it. Typically, employees, you know, are responsible for maintenance and upkeep, or if the employer is providing it, you know, it's the employer's job. And I'm sure Thursday's webinar will get into some of that. The guidelines also ask for workspace, you know, some, you know, that you have to have a designated workspace, as well as, you know, how to deal with non-teleworkers so that they're not impacted. Here's a form, and this is also in the template that Dan will refer to at the end, because we have sent a quick start kit. We have developed one. It's on the website. This is sometimes, again, these categories can shift, but it's not a bad idea to have an agreement which basically says the employee is going to work at the following location, and it's clear, you know, it's their home address, or wherever, you know, they're going to be for the period of the emergency, maybe some idea of how many days. Also have some clarity around the dates. When will this start and when will this end? You know, because if this is just for this period, you want to be clear or say, you know, the date will depend on, you know, COVID-19. Establish some framework around the hours, some understanding of assignments, the equipment, and what's required in terms of communications. Sometimes there's a signature line at the bottom of this, so, you know, the employee fills it out and the manager signs it so that it at least says we've all agreed to the conditions of this arrangement. So I want to share with you that our consulting services have not changed. We are still able to deliver all of these to you through technology, through training, you know, with video conferencing or PowerPoint-based, you know, programs. We're still even able to record tailored training for employers that require it. We are still here armed with a lot of data and experience on, you know, how teleworking has been played out, you know, in different employer settings. And we can help you with the design of those agreements, the guidelines, the policies. We can help you with your technology needs. And very importantly, we also are here to help you evaluate. It's important that as you are going through teleworking, that you know, even as managers, I think, you know, that there are points at which managers are getting together with employees and assessing what's working and what's not working, because there has to be a huge feedback loop. And we're available to do focus groups for you, again, virtually, and those work pretty well. We also have surveys if you're interested in them. So none of our services have changed. It's just that you won't be seeing us face to face for a little bit. So thank you, Dan. I'm going to give it back to you.
Thanks, Ilham. As we wind down the webinar, I just want to make sure you are all aware of the following resources that are available on the that Georgia Commute Options website. There you can find the recording of the webinar we did last week, which was managed remotely. You can also download that PDF, the Telework Quick Start Guide that Elham mentioned. It's got that Telework agreement that Elham just went over. It's also got some manager and teleworkers do's and do nots. So you can just, by putting in your email, you can access that PDF there. There's also a link to the CDC's guidance for businesses for those employers who might not be teleworking in force yet. And finally, if you haven't registered for a final webinar this Thursday, you can access the Eventbrite registration on the website as well. We're going to conclude this series with a webinar on the collaborative technologies for telework this Thursday at 2 p.m. It'll be hosted by Barry O'Brien of Partner Consulting, and will be a great presentation for folks who they may not be familiar with collaborative resource technology or program management software like Slack, Microsoft Teams, those kind of resources. And if you're not super tech savvy, it might be something that you want to listen into on Thursday. Before we get into question and answer, I just wanted to thank you all again for attending today. I especially wanted to thank Elham and the rest of the TMAs that have contributed to this GCO webinar series. If you're an employer in one of these organizations, please reach out if you have any questions or are looking for additional resources. And the very last thing I have here is this QR code. If you wouldn't mind just taking 5 minutes, just pulling out your phone, taking a quick snapshot of that QR code, so that way on the back end, you'll see a Survey Monkey. Again, it shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, and it'll really help us to get your feedback and let us know how we can improve. So with that, it looks like right now we don't have any questions in the queue. For those who, if any questions that came up, let's go ahead and I'll shift over to moderate those questions for Elham and Katie.
Oh, all our services are free, by the way, if I didn't mention that. All the services you receive from the Georgia Commute Options and from the TMAs, or the Transportation Management Associations, are at no cost to the employers.
I'll go ahead and wait a few more minutes to see if we have any questions that pop up. If for some reason you have a lot of background noise too, feel free to go ahead and use that webinar chat to type in questions.
Dan, a few people asked about where they can see the recording. You may want to just emphasize again how they can get access to last week and today's recording.
So in a couple of things with that, Elham, is that with the Eventbrite registration, we will have gotten your email from that process, and we'll go ahead and send out the recording around this time tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. So the recording will be sent that way. And then also on that Georgia Commute Options website that I mentioned before in that last slide, there you'll be able to access links as they become available. So there's a couple of different options for to access those previous recordings. And then the third one, which we eventually do that on Thursday. I'm gonna go back to this QR code. For those of you who can see, we just put the previous recordings link in the webinar chat there. All right, I'll go ahead.
Is it a wrap?
Well, I'll go ahead and keep this up for a couple more minutes in case people need to use the QR code. But unless I see any questions come up, have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Dan and GCO and Elham as well.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Dan, I don't know if you can add the link to the feedback survey on the chat box. It looks like a couple people are asking for that.
Yeah, we can go ahead and add that link into the chat box.